200,000 men dug their own graves and did not know it. They had already surrendered. Their swords were gone, their banners burned, their officers marching in a column that stretched for miles under guard. They believed the war was over for them. They believed they were being led toward resettlement, toward farmland, toward the ordinary mercy that victors sometimes extend to men who no longer threaten them. Instead, on a black night near a town called Xin'an, they were driven into ravines that had been prepared in advance, and there, in silence, broken only by screaming that did not last as long as you would expect, they were buried. Some of them alive. The order came from a 26-year-old man who 4 months earlier had been a subordinate general with no independent command at all. His name was Xiang Yu. He is remembered today as one of the greatest battlefield commanders in Chinese history, a man capable of feats of tactical audacity that historians still study more than 2,000 years later. He is also remembered for this. The two facts do not cancel each other out. They sit next to each other, uncomfortably, the way most true things about powerful men tend to sit. This is the story of how a starving, outnumbered relief force broke an empire's finest army at a town called Julu, and how the same commander who achieved that impossible victory turned, weeks later, into the architect of one of the largest mass killings of surrendered soldiers in recorded history. It is a story historians have argued over for 2 millennia because it refuses to resolve into a simple lesson. The record we have of it comes largely from one man, a court historian named Sima Qian, writing roughly a century after the events, drawing on earlier documents and oral testimony that no longer survive independently. Where the numbers strain belief, we will say so. Where the sources disagree, we will say that too. But the shape of what happened is not in serious dispute, and the shape alone is enough to make you uneasy about how easily a rational calculation can become an atrocity. To understand why a young Chu nobleman ended up ordering the deaths of 200,000 disarmed men, you have to go back further than the siege of Julu, back to the empire whose collapse made all of this possible. The Qin Dynasty had unified China only 15 years earlier, in 221 BC, after more than 2 centuries of warring states tearing each other apart. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, had built something genuinely new, a centralized bureaucratic state, standardized weights and measures, a single system of writing, roads and canals that bound the conquered territories together, whether their populations wanted to be bound or not. He had also built it on a foundation of forced labor, brutal conscription, and a legal code so punitive that minor infractions could cost a man his life or his family's freedom. When he died in 210 BC, his empire did not have long left, though almost no one alive at the time could have known that yet. The man who inherited the throne, Qin Shi, the second emperor, was a weak ruler manipulated by a court eunuch named Zhao Gao, whose appetite for consolidating power at the expense of the state itself would prove, over the following years, to be one of the more corrosive forces in the dynasty's final collapse. Within a year of the old emperor's death, rebellion broke out. 2 conscript laborers, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, delayed by rain on the road to a labor assignment, realized that Qin law would execute them for the delay, regardless of whether it was their fault. Facing death either way, they chose rebellion instead, and their revolt, though it would be crushed within months, cracked something open across the empire that could not be closed again. Former nobility from the conquered states, resentful commoners, ambitious opportunists, all of them began raising armies, restoring old titles, carving out territory. Among them was a former Chu general's grandson named Xiang Liang, and his nephew, a young man of unusual size and unusual temper, named Xiang Yu. The state of Chu had been one of the great powers of the Warring States period before Qin destroyed it, and there was a particular bitterness in how it fell. A Chu general named Xiang Yu, Xiang Yu's grandfather, had died fighting the Qin conquest. There is a saying that circulated in the aftermath of Chu's destruction: even if only 3 households of Chu remain, it will be Chu that destroys Qin. Whether or not the saying predates the events it supposedly predicted, it captures something true about the emotional undercurrent driving men like Xiang Yu. This was not, for him, simply a war of ambition. It was inherited grievance, a debt he had been raised to believe someone in his family was obligated to collect. Xiang Yu is described in the sources as physically enormous for his time, capable of lifting a bronze cauldron that ordinary soldiers couldn't budge, fierce enough in single combat that men reportedly would not meet his eyes. He was also, by his own uncle's account, someone who resisted formal education. He abandoned the study of writing because it only taught him to record his own name, and he abandoned swordsmanship because it only let him defeat one man at a time. What he wanted, he said, was to learn the art of defeating 10,000 men. This detail, small as it is, tells you something important. From very early on, Xiang Yu thought in terms of scale. He was not a man drawn to individual mercy or individual cruelty as isolated acts. He thought about masses of men the way an engineer thinks about load-bearing weight. And that habit of mind would eventually apply itself to a decision involving 200,000 lives at once. By 208 BC, Xiang Liang had built a substantial rebel army and restored a puppet descendant of the old Chu royal line, a boy called King Huai, largely as a legitimizing figurehead. Then Xiang Liang was killed in battle against the Qin general Zhang Han, and the rebel Chu leadership fell into a precarious situation. A young, inexperienced nominal king, a demoralized army, and a Qin general who had just proven himself extremely dangerous. Zhang Han deserves his own introduction because he is not a minor figure in this story. He is, in many ways, its second protagonist, and his own fate by the end of it is one of the more quietly tragic threads running through the whole affair. He had been a minister of finance and public works before the rebellions broke out. Not a career soldier. But when Chen Sheng's rebellion reached the outskirts of the capital, it was Zhang Han who proposed arming the enormous convict labor force, building the first emperor's tomb, and using them as an emergency army. It worked. Zhang Han crushed rebel force after rebel force through 209 and 208 BC, with a speed and ruthlessness that made him, for a time, the single most feared commander on either side of the conflict. He killed Xiang Liang. He crushed the rebellion of Chen Sheng's successors. By late 208 BC, having dealt with the Chu-aligned rebels for the moment, Zhang Han turned his attention north toward the resurgent state of Zhao and laid siege to its king and its chief general inside the walled town of Julu. He did not besiege Julu carelessly. Zhang Han built fortified corridors, walled, covered supply roads, running from his main depot to the siege lines, protecting his logistics from harassment, and ensuring his forces at Julu could be fed and reinforced indefinitely, while the defenders inside starved. He detached another general, Wang Li, the grandson of one of the first emperor's most celebrated commanders, to conduct the direct assault and blockade, while Zhang Han himself held a strong position to the south, ready to crush any relief force that came. On paper, the position was close to unbreakable. A walled town, cut off, facing a siege army with secure supply lines and a second field army in reserve behind it, commanded by the most successful general the dynasty had left. Historians estimate the combined Qin forces in the theater at somewhere in the range of 200,000 men. Though ancient troop figures across this entire war are notoriously inflated and should be treated as approximate at best. Whatever the precise number, It was enough that no one expected Zhao to survive, and no one expected whatever relief force the fractured rebel coalition could scrape together to make much difference. It is worth pausing here on the asymmetry, because everything that follows depends on understanding just how lopsided this looked from the outside. Zhang Han commanded veteran soldiers, secure supply lines, and the psychological weight of an unbroken string of victories. The Chu relief force being assembled to march north was smaller, worse supplied, and led, at least nominally, by a commander named Xiang Yu, a cautious, calculating official whom King Huai had placed above Xiang Yu specifically because the young king's advisors distrusted Xiang Yu's temper and worried what an unchecked, vengeance-driven commander might do with independent authority. Xiang Yu was given the position of deputy. He answered to Song Yi, and Song Yi, watching the numbers, made a decision that from a purely rational standpoint was defensible. He would not march directly into a fight against Zhang Han's reserve army. He would wait. Let Qin and Zhao exhaust each other at Julu, he reasoned, and Chu would strike only once both sides were weakened. A strategy of patience, dressed up as strategy of opportunism. Before we go further into how that patience curdled into fury, it's worth staying with this camp for one more moment, because the sources give us a detail that tells you exactly what kind of army this was. It was autumn, moving into winter. Rain fell for days on the camp at Anyang, where Song Yi had halted the march. The soldiers, most of them peasants and conscripts who had joined the rebellion out of hunger and desperation rather than ideology, had almost nothing to eat. Beans and vegetables, the sources say, no grain, while Song Yi himself hosted a lavish banquet for a diplomatic envoy, drinking heavily, dressed for comfort against the cold. His own men did not have the clothing to survive. 46 days. That is how long Song Yi held the army at Anyang, while Zhao's defenders inside Julu starved and Zhang Han's siege lines tightened. Xiang Yu watched this, and something in him that had been simmering since his uncle's death, since his grandfather's death, since the destruction of the state he'd been raised to avenge, reached its limit. If you have ever worked under someone whose caution you experienced as cowardice, whose reasonable-sounding explanations felt, every single day, like an excuse to avoid the thing that actually needed doing, you already understand the emotional register of what happened next, even if the stakes here were somewhat higher than an office disagreement. Xiang Yu walked into Song Yi's tent one morning and killed him. He did it himself, with his own hand. And then he walked back out and told the assembled generals that Song Yi had been secretly conspiring with Qin against the interests of Chu, a claim the sources treat with visible skepticism, framing it as a justification constructed after the fact rather than a genuine accusation Xiang Yu had evidence for. It did not matter. The generals, whether out of fear, genuine agreement, or simple recognition that the balance of power in the camp had just changed permanently, backed him. King Huai, hundreds of miles away, and in no position to contest a fait accompli delivered by an army that had just demonstrated its willingness to murder a commander who displeased it, confirmed Xiang Yu as supreme commander of the Chu relief force. Notice what has just happened, because it matters for everything that follows. The man who would soon make one of the most consequential command decisions in the history of Chinese warfare had arrived at that authority through an act of violent insubordination against a superior whose caution, however unheroic, may well have been the more defensible military judgment. Xiang Yu did not inherit command through the normal channels of trust and demonstrated competence. He seized it through an act of will backed by force, and having seized it, he now needed to prove, immediately, decisively, publicly, that the seizure had been justified. There is no way to know for certain how much this pressure shaped what he did next, but it is difficult to imagine it played no role at all. What Xiang Yu did next has become, In the 2,000 years since, one of the most famous acts of battlefield psychology in Chinese military history, still referenced today as an idiom in the language, Po Fu Chen Zhou. Break the cauldrons, sink the boats. He crossed the Jiang River with his army. Sources differ on the total, with most estimates putting Chu's relief force at somewhere between a fraction and roughly a third the size of the combined Qin forces waiting on the other side, though as with most ancient figures, these should be read as rough orders of magnitude rather than precise counts. Once every soldier had crossed, Xiang Yu gave an order that must have seemed, to men already frightened by what they were about to face, close to insane. Sink the boats, all of them. Break every cooking cauldron. Burn the shelters. Issue each man exactly 3 days of rations and nothing more. Consider what this actually did, mechanically, to 200,000, or however many thousand, human beings standing on the wrong side of a river from home. There was no way back across the water. There was no way to cook a meal that hadn't already been rationed out. There was no tent to return to at the end of the day if the fighting went badly, and a soldier wanted to simply survive the battle by hanging back and letting others do the dying. Every single man in that army now had exactly one path to staying alive longer than 3 days. Win, and win quickly, and take what they needed from the enemy they were about to attack. Retreat had not been made difficult. It had been made physically impossible. This is the moment worth sitting with before we move into the fighting itself, because it is the clearest expression of something that will recur again and again through this story, a form of reasoning that is genuinely rational within its own frame and genuinely monstrous in its implications. And the uncomfortable truth is that those two qualities are not in tension with each other. They are the same quality, viewed from two different distances. Sinking the boats solved a real tactical problem. An underfed, outnumbered, demoralized army facing a superior force needed some mechanism to convert desperation into unified, maximal effort, rather than into disintegration and flight. It worked. It is still taught, in one form or another, in military academies, as a case study in commitment devices. The deliberate removal of your own escape routes as a way of forcing maximum effort from yourself or your subordinates. But it worked by making 200,000 men's individual survival contingent entirely on obedience to a single, irreversible, do-or-die order issued by a commander who had taken his position 4 months earlier by killing the man above him. Rational calculation and moral horror, sitting in the same tent, sharing the same meal of 3 days' rations. If a decision like that unsettles you as much as it should, a commander converting his own soldiers' fear of death into a weapon by removing every alternative to fighting. Sit with that feeling for a moment, because it's going to come back later in a much darker form, and understanding why it worked here is the only way to understand why the later decision felt, to the man who made it, like the same kind of logic applied at a larger scale. The Chu army marched on Julu with 3 days of food in their packs, and the Jiang River sunk shut behind them. Inside Julu itself, through all of this waiting and calculating happening beyond their walls, a different kind of time was passing. The slow, grinding time of a besieged population running out of food. The Zhao King, Zhao Xia, and his chief general, Xiang Yu, had been sealed inside for months by the time Xiang Yu even crossed the Jiang River. Sima Qian tells us almost nothing about the interior of the siege in granular day-by-day terms, and it would be dishonest to invent detail the sources don't give us. But we know, from the broader pattern of ancient siege warfare, and from what the sources do say about the desperation of the eventual relief, that a besieged city cut off for months by an army with secure supply lines faces a specific, narrowing set of realities. Grain stores that shrink by calculation rather than by chance. animals eaten long before the people are, walls manned by soldiers whose strength is being spent faster than it can be replaced by the food remaining to replace it. Every morning that passed without the ring of Qian siege works breaking was, for the people inside Julu, both a small relief and a small subtraction from whatever reserves were keeping them alive. They could not have known that a dozen armies were camped nearby, watching, doing nothing. From inside those walls, the entire outside world would have felt like silence. The particular, specific silence of abandonment, made worse by the certainty that somewhere beyond the horizon, men who could help them had chosen not to. By the time Xiang Yu's forces reached the vicinity of Julu, more than a dozen other rebel lords and their armies had already arrived in the region. Commanders from the restored states of Yan, Qi, and elsewhere, drawn north by the same siege, the same opportunity, the same danger. And every single one of them had made the same calculation Song Yi had made before Xiang Yu killed him for it. Watch. Wait. Let Qin and Zhao bleed each other. Commit nothing until the outcome is clear. They built their camps in a ring around the periphery of the battle zone and did not move. Sima Qian records that more than 10 separate rebel armies sat behind their own fortifications during the fighting that followed, close enough to see the smoke, too cautious to commit a single soldier. This is the detail that turns the Battle of Julu from a straightforward military engagement into something closer to a public spectacle, with an audience of armed, silent witnesses. And it's worth trying to picture it honestly. Thousands of soldiers from a dozen different commands, standing on the ramparts of their own fortified camps, watching an army roughly a fraction their combined size march out to attack the strongest force in the empire. An army that had, by design, no way to retreat even if it wanted to. Some of those watching soldiers would have known men in Xiang Yu's ranks. Some would have recognized the strategic insanity of what they were witnessing and assumed they were about to watch an entire army annihilate itself for nothing. Nobody moved to help. What happened over the following days, the sources describe 9 separate engagements, fought at close range, cutting the supply corridors Zhang Han had built to sustain Wang Li's siege, has to be understood at 2 levels simultaneously: the level of grand strategy and the level of an individual soldier's body in the mud, because the sources themselves keep sliding between these registers, and that sliding is not an accident of the storytelling. It's the actual texture of what battle is. At the level of strategy, Xiang Yu's first target was not Wang Li's main siege force directly, but the raised, walled supply corridors Zhang Han had constructed to feed it. Cut those, and Wang Li's army, however large, however well-equipped, begins to starve exactly the way the defenders of Julu had been starving for months. It is a move that inverts the entire logic of the siege. The besiegers become the besieged, deprived of the very advantage that made the operation viable in the first place. Chu forces attacked those supply lines repeatedly, forcing engagement after engagement, refusing to let Qin regroup or consolidate. At the level of an individual body, picture a Chu soldier who has eaten nothing but the last of his 3 days' rations, advancing at dawn toward a raised earthen corridor defended by better-fed, better-armored Qin troops who have spent months building fortifications and know this ground intimately. His hands are cold enough that gripping the spear shaft is its own small effort of will. He can hear, before he can see, the particular grinding rattle of armored men moving into formation on the other side of the rise, a sound that experienced soldiers learn to read the way sailors read weather, because it tells you roughly how many men and how disciplined they are before a single one becomes visible. There is a specific smell that settles over ground that has already seen days of fighting. Wet earth turned over by trenching, the copper edge of old blood that rain has not fully washed away. Wood smoke from cook fires he knows are not his own, because his own were burned before the river crossing. And underneath all of that, one plain thought: the kind of thought any human being would have in that position. Stripped of any grander ideology about Chu or Qin or vengeance for a general who died before this soldier was even born. There is no boat behind me. The fighting is described, in the most quoted line from the sources, as Chu soldiers each equal to 10 men, an assessment attributed to the watching lords, meant to convey the sheer intensity and desperation of the attack rather than a literal battlefield ratio, though it is exactly the kind of number that later chroniclers and popular memory tend to take at face value. What the phrase is really describing, stripped of its hyperbole, is what happens to an army's effective combat power when every single man in its ranks has been placed, deliberately, in a position where fighting is statistically safer than not fighting. Fear did not need to be overcome through courage. It had been redirected through structure. Several times over the course of these engagements, the outcome must have looked, from the vantage point of the watching lords on their walls, like it was tipping decisively toward Qin. Wang Li's forces, after all, still substantially outnumbered the Chu relief army, even after the supply corridor raids began. There would have been moments. The sources do not narrate them in the kind of granular hour-by-hour detail we might wish for. And this is a point worth being honest about, because it means some of the texture of these turning points has to be reconstructed from the general shape of protracted siege combat, rather than quoted directly from a specific passage, where a Qin counterattack briefly stabilized a threatened section of the line, where a relief column of grain finally got through before being cut off again, where it must have seemed to the exhausted, hungry Chu soldiers that their sacrifice was not going to be enough after all. Each of those moments of apparent stabilization for Qin, and each moment of despair for Chu, is exactly the kind of false hope and reversal that defines this entire campaign. And it is worth remembering, as you picture them, that neither side actually knew which of these moments was the real turning point until it had already passed. What we do know, because the sources are explicit about the outcome, even where they are sparse on the middle, is that Xiang Yu's forces broke the siege. Wang Li was captured. Another Qin commander, Su Jiao, was killed in the fighting, and Zhang Han, commanding the larger secondary Qin army that was supposed to crush any relief force before it ever reached Julu, the reserve strength that had made the entire Qin position look unbreakable from the outside, withdrew, rather than committing his own forces to a decisive engagement against an enemy that had just demonstrated it would rather die attacking than survive retreating. That single decision by Zhang Han, to pull back rather than commit, deserves scrutiny rather than easy judgment, because it is the hinge on which the rest of this entire story turns. And it was not, on its face, an unreasonable choice for the man making it. Zhang Han had spent the previous year watching rebel armies rise and fall with dizzying speed. He had crushed most of them. He had no particular reason, based on everything he had seen up to that point, to believe that this particular rebel coalition, fractured, mostly still cowering behind its own walls, led by a man who had murdered his own commanding officer weeks earlier, represented an existential threat rather than one more uprising to be managed and eventually crushed at a moment of his own choosing. Withdrawal from where Zhang Han stood looked like patience. It looked like refusing to be baited into a costly engagement by an enemy whose battlefield ferocity, however impressive, could not by itself overturn Qin's much larger strategic position across the empire. It was the same logic Song Yi had used to justify waiting at Anyang. It simply happened to be wrong, at a moment when being wrong carried consequences no one on either side could yet fully see. Julu was relieved. Zhao's king and chief general emerged from behind their walls after months of starvation to find themselves free, and to find that freedom, purchased not by the dozen armies that had camped within sight of their suffering, but by a smaller force that had crossed a river with no way home and had simply refused to lose. What followed, in the days after the siege was broken, is one of the more quietly devastating details in the entire account, because it tells you everything about how power actually redistributes itself after a moment like this. The other rebel lords, the ones who had watched from behind their own fortifications, who had committed nothing, who had let a smaller force bleed for an outcome they would all benefit from, came to Xiang Yu's camp to pay their respects. And according to the sources, when they entered the gate of his command post, they did so on their knees, advancing forward without daring to lift their heads to look him in the face. Think about what that image actually represents. These were not humble men. They were commanders of their own armies, rulers or would-be rulers of restored kingdoms, men who had spent the previous months making exactly the same cautious, self-preserving calculation Song Yi had made, and Xiang Yu had murdered him for. And now they crawled. Not because Xiang Yu had defeated them in battle, he hadn't fought any of them, but because he had done the one thing none of them had been willing to do, and everyone present understood, instantly and without needing to be told, what that meant for the balance of power going forward. Courage, or the specific, terrifying variety of it that comes from removing your own option to retreat, had just been converted, in the space of a few weeks, into the single most valuable currency in a fractured empire. A 26-year-old man who 4 months earlier answered to a cautious superior now had a dozen kings kneeling at his gate. If you're finding this story as strange and as compelling as I did putting it together, a battle won by an army with no way home, decided in front of an audience that refused to fight, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for, and there's a subscribe button right below this video that costs nothing and means the difference between catching the next one of these or missing it entirely. Because what came next did not stay in the register of triumph for very long. Slow down for a moment on the exact instant everything actually turned, because it is smaller and quieter than the sweeping numbers around it suggest. It was not the 9th engagement, or the death of Su Jiao, or the capture of Wang Li that decided this. It was earlier than that, and it happened inside one man's mind, rather than on the battlefield at all. Somewhere along the fighting, at a point the sources do not pin to an exact hour, Zhang Han received word of how the engagements at the supply corridors were going, and made the calculation to hold his reserve rather than commit it. That is the entire decisive moment. No dramatic clash of arms, no single sword stroke that changed the outcome. A general weighing risk against reward with the same rational competence that had made him the most successful commander of the war so far, chose caution at the one moment in the entire campaign when caution was the wrong answer. He did not know that yet. He would not know it for certain until it was too late to reverse. Word of the withdrawal would have reached the fighting lines gradually, not as a single announced fact, but as a slow shift in the pressure Chu troops felt against them, a slackening they could feel in their bodies before anyone told them what it meant. And on the other side, inside Julu's walls, the defenders would have felt the opposite, a first disbelieving loosening of a grip that had been tightening around their throats for months, the kind of realization that takes several full breaths to trust before you allow yourself to believe it. Somewhere, a Qin officer under Wang Li's command understood, in the space of a single order relayed down the line, that the reinforcements were not coming, that the very army meant to guarantee his position had just chosen not to be there. That is the moment reality changed. Everything after it, all the way to the capture of Wang Li and the flight of the survivors, was simply that realization propagating outward from one man's decision to the tens of thousands of men whose fates depended on it. Zhang Han did not immediately surrender. He withdrew, regrouped, and over the following months fought a series of increasingly desperate engagements against Xiang Yu's advancing forces, retreating step by step across the region while his own position at the Qin court deteriorated in ways that had nothing to do with the battlefield at all. Back in the capital, the eunuch Zhao Gao, who had already engineered the death of the capable minister Li Si and effectively controlled the puppet second emperor, viewed Zhang Han's repeated setbacks with suspicion rather than sympathy. Messages sent to request reinforcements went unanswered or were met with hostility. Zhang Han, the man who had crushed rebellion after rebellion and very nearly ended this entire war before it truly began, found himself caught between an advancing enemy in front of him and a court behind him that seemed increasingly likely to blame him for failure regardless of what he did next, possibly even to execute him for it, the way other officials who displeased Zhao Gao had recently been executed. This is the asymmetria that decided the rest of the war more than any single battle did. Zhang Han was fighting Xiang Yu with one hand, while defending his own life against his own government with the other, and eventually, the second fight became the one he could not win by continuing to fight the first. In the summer of 207 BC, after months of retreat and negotiation, Zhang Han made his decision. He surrendered his entire army to Xiang Yu. The sources put the number of Qin soldiers who laid down their arms at this surrender at approximately 200,000. This is, by any reasonable modern accounting, a staggering figure, and it deserves the same scrutiny we've applied to other ancient troop numbers throughout this account. Sima Qian, writing roughly a century after the fact, is our primary source for this figure. And while historians broadly accept that the surrender was massive, large enough to fundamentally alter the balance of the war overnight, the precise count of 200,000 should be understood as the figure the tradition settled on, rather than a number verified by any independent census. What is not in serious dispute is the scale of the problem this surrender created for Xiang Yu, because whatever the exact number, it was almost certainly larger than his own army, and that fact alone reshapes everything that follows. Consider the position Xiang Yu now found himself in. He commanded a Chu-led coalition army that for months had been fighting and dying against these exact soldiers. Many of his own men had lost friends, brothers, fathers, to this same Qin force in the engagements at Julu and in the months of running battles that followed. And now, in a single stroke, that enemy force had become nominally his, a mass of surrendered soldiers, larger than his own army, marching alongside his men on the long westward road toward the Qin heartland, the region called Guanzhong, where the dynasty's capital and its remaining loyalist forces waited. What the sources tell us happened on that march is not a single dramatic incident, but an accumulating pressure, the kind of slow-building danger that is much harder to narrate cleanly than a battle, because it built up over days and weeks through countless small interactions rather than one clear turning point. Chu soldiers, resentful of years of Qin oppression and specific personal losses in the fighting that had just ended, treated the surrendered Qin troops with contempt, humiliating them, abusing them, in some accounts, even robbing or mistreating them outright as the column moved west. And the surrendered soldiers, for their part, began to talk among themselves. If Xiang Yu's forces failed to take the capital region, they reasoned, they themselves would likely be killed as enemy collaborators by the remaining Qin authorities they were technically still subjects of. And if Xiang Yu's forces did succeed in taking Guanzhong, these same surrendered men, still resentful of the treatment they'd received on the march, might turn on their new commanders the moment an opportunity presented itself, given that most of them still had families and homes inside the very region everyone was marching toward. Picture, for a moment, one particular soldier inside that column, because the 200,000 is easier to feel honestly if you let it narrow down to one man before it widens back out to its full, unbearable scale. He had served under Zhang Han for years, had likely survived engagements against the very rebel forces he now marched alongside as a defeated captive. He walks without armor now. That was surrendered, along with everything else. And the late summer heat sits differently on unarmored shoulders than it ever did in service, exposed in a way that feels less like relief and more like vulnerability, though he could not have said precisely why. He hears, most days, the particular tone Chu soldiers use when addressing the surrendered men. Not shouted abuse, usually, but something quieter and worse, a kind of contempt, delivered almost casually. The way you might speak to livestock rather than to an enemy you respect enough to hate properly. At night, in whatever makeshift camp the column has stopped at, he talks with the men near him in low voices about what waits at the end of this road. Home, if they're lucky, and the war ends cleanly, or a mass grave dug by their own former enemies, if it doesn't. He has, by this point, no way of independently verifying which future is more likely. He can only walk and wait and try not to be noticed. Word of these murmurs reached Xiang Yu's senior officers, and here is where we arrive at the exact calculation this entire story turns on, the one that connects the desperate genius of the boat-sinking order at the Jiang River to the horror that followed it, because it is, structurally, the same kind of reasoning, applied this time not to his own men's survival instinct, but to an enemy's. At a war council, according to the account that has come down to us, Xiang Yu's senior commanders laid out the danger explicitly. The surrendered Qin soldiers vastly outnumbered the Chu-led coalition forces. If the army continued west into Guangzhong and encountered resistance, there was a real risk that the surrendered men, resentful and afraid, would revolt from within at the worst possible moment, catching Xiang Yu's forces between an external enemy and a mutiny inside their own marching column. Annihilation not through defeat in open battle, but through betrayal from a force that was never truly loyal to begin with. The safer course, they argued, was to eliminate the risk before it could be realized. We do not have a transcript of this council. We do not know how much debate there was, whether anyone argued against the plan, whether Xiang Yu himself hesitated before agreeing. The sources give us the calculation and the outcome, not the internal weighing between them, and it is worth being honest that this silence is itself a kind of information, a reminder that history, especially ancient history, compiled a century after the fact by a court historian working from earlier records and testimony that we can no longer independently check, often preserves the decision far more completely than it preserves the deliberation. What we do know is what happened next. Under cover of night, near the town of Xin'an, Chu forces surrounded the encamped, surrendered Qin army. Men who had already given up their weapons, who believed themselves prisoners on a long march toward an uncertain but at least survivable future, and drove them into a series of pits and ravines that had been selected and prepared in advance. There, in the dark, they were killed. Buried, according to the account, some of them while still alive. The scale the sources report is the same figure attached to the original surrender, approximately 200,000 men. We can describe the mechanics of that night without inventing what the sources do not give us. The surrounding would have needed to happen quietly, in the dark, before the surrendered men, still organized in their own loose groupings, still, in some residual military sense, a body of soldiers even without weapons, could recognize what was happening and attempt any kind of collective resistance. Whatever warning individual men received would have come only in the last moments, in the sound of a perimeter closing where no perimeter should have been, in torchlight appearing in a pattern that did not match the ordinary business of a marching camp settling in for the night. There would have been no battle in any real sense of the word, because there was nothing left to fight with. What there would have been is a very large number of unarmed men, and a very short amount of time between confusion and the end of it. We do not know whether they understood what was happening, even as it happened to them, and we should resist the temptation to narrate false certainty into that darkness, simply because uncertainty is harder to sit with. 3 men were spared. Zhang Han himself, along with 2 of his senior subordinate generals, Sima Xin and Dong Yi, were kept alive, not out of mercy in any conventional sense, but because Xiang Yu still needed them. They knew the terrain of Guanzhong. They had legitimacy with what remained of Qin's military and administrative structure that could ease the coalition's path into the capital region. Their usefulness, in other words, is what kept them breathing, in precisely the same cold calculus that had condemned everyone beneath them in rank to the ravines. It is difficult to imagine what it was like to be Zhang Han in the days and weeks that followed, a general who had surrendered his army in good faith, on terms, only to watch nearly the entirety of that army exterminated by the very commander he had surrendered to, while he himself was kept alive as a useful tool for the same campaign that had just annihilated the men who had trusted his judgment enough to lay down their arms when he told them to. Whatever Zhang Han felt in that moment, the sources do not record it. They simply note that he continued to serve, because at that point, what other option was left to him? It would be a mistake to imagine Xiang Yu as someone gleefully indulging cruelty here, and it would be an equally serious mistake to let that absence of glee stand in for justification. The sources give us no indication of hesitation, but they also give us no indication of relish. What they give us is a decision presented, structurally, as risk management, a calculation about probability and consequence made by a commander who, 4 months earlier, had solved a different problem of mass human behavior by removing his own soldiers' option to retreat, and who now solved this problem by removing, permanently, an enemy force's option to ever pose a threat at all. The boat sunk at the Zhang River, and the pits dug outside. Xin'an are separated by only a few months, and by an almost identical structure of thought. Identify the danger inherent in a large mass of frightened, uncertain men, and eliminate the danger by controlling, completely and irreversibly, what happens to their bodies. In one case, that control produced one of the most celebrated victories in the history of Chinese warfare. In the other, it produced a massacre still cited, more than 2,000 years later, as one of the darkest single acts committed by any of the era's warlords, proportionally larger, in terms of lives extinguished in a single coordinated action, than almost anything else recorded from this entire period of Chinese history. The weeks that followed moved with the strange, accelerated momentum of a war that everyone could suddenly tell was ending. With the Qin army effectively destroyed and its most capable field commander now a subordinate rather than an opponent, the path into Guanzhong lay open. Xiang Yu advanced on the Qin heartland to find that another rebel leader, a former minor official named Liu Bang, had reached the capital region first, accepted the surrender of the last Qin ruler, and, notably, in a contrast the sources seem to draw deliberately, had refrained from sacking the city or slaughtering its population, choosing instead to secure the treasury and issue a simplified legal code intended to win the trust of a population exhausted by decades of harsh Qin law. This single decision, made by the man who would eventually become Xiang Yu's great rival for control of the empire, sits in the record as a quiet counterpoint to everything that had just happened at Xin'an, though neither man could have known at the time how much that early contrast in temperament would foreshadow the eventual outcome of their rivalry. Xiang Yu, arriving afterward with the much larger coalition army at his back, was furious to find Liu Bang already in control of the capital region, and the tension between the two men over who had truly earned the right to that territory over a promise King Huai had made that whoever entered Guanzhong first would rule it, became the central fault line of the years that followed. Xiang Yu forced Liu Bang into a humiliating but non-fatal submission at a famous banquet, then proceeded to do something that, in hindsight, looks less like triumph and more like the beginning of his own undoing. He entered the Qin capital, executed the last Qin ruler, despite that ruler having already surrendered peacefully to Liu Bang, and burned the imperial palaces to the ground. A fire the sources claim burned for months, consuming a complex of buildings and accumulated treasures that had taken the first emperor's entire reign to construct. Then, rather than establishing himself as the new unifying emperor of a reconstituted state, Xiang Yu carved the conquered territory into 18 separate kingdoms, rewarding loyal commanders and allied lords with fiefdoms, and had himself declared not emperor, but hegemon king of Western Chu, a title that placed him above the other kings without formally claiming the imperial throne itself. It is worth sitting with the irony embedded in that decision, because it is one of several genuinely paradoxical outcomes this story produces. The same man who had just demonstrated, through the massacre at Xin'an, a willingness to eliminate any force he judged a future threat, regardless of the human cost, chose in this moment of maximum leverage not to consolidate absolute personal power over a unified empire, but to distribute it back out among a collection of regional rulers, a decentralized arrangement that, within a few short years, would collapse into exactly the kind of internal warfare it was meant to prevent, as ambitious kings turned on each other and on Xiang Yu himself. Liu Bang, assigned a comparatively modest kingdom far to the west, in the remote and mountainous region of Hanzhong, spent the following years rebuilding his strength, absorbing defectors, and slowly, methodically outmaneuvering Xiang Yu across a war that would come to be remembered as the Chu-Han Contention. The final irony of this story, the one that gives it its closest thing to a moral shape without ever quite resolving into a tidy lesson, arrived 5 years later, in 202 BC, at a place called Gaixia. Xiang Yu, the commander who had once broken an unbreakable siege by leaving himself no way to retreat, found himself surrounded in almost the mirror image of that earlier position, cut off, outnumbered, his forces dwindling, listening at night to Han soldiers singing songs of his own home region of Chu, a psychological tactic meant to convince his remaining troops that Chu itself had already fallen, and further resistance was pointless. He broke out with a small remaining escort, was pursued, and eventually took his own life at the bank of the Wu River rather than be captured, reportedly refusing an offer of a boat that could have carried him to safety across the water. A final, quiet echo, whether the sources intended or not, of the boats he had ordered sunk at the start of his rise. The man whose career had been defined by removing escape routes, first his own, and then an enemy's by more permanent means, chose in the end not to take the escape route that was actually offered to him. Zhang Han, the general spared at Xin'an for his usefulness, continued serving as a commander for a period under the new territorial arrangement, was eventually defeated by Liu Bang's forces in the fighting that followed, and took his own life as well in 205 BC, a quiet end for a man whose military talent had, at the outset of this whole conflict, come closer than almost anyone else's to crushing the entire rebellion before it could grow into what it became. Of the 200,000 men who did not survive the night outside Xin'an, we know almost nothing individually. No names have come down to us, no family accounts, no personal letters, no gravestones raised by relatives who might have wanted to mark where a father or a son had died. For most of Chinese history since, they existed only as a number in a historian's account, a scale so large it becomes difficult to hold in the mind as 200,000 individual human beings rather than a single abstract catastrophe. In recent decades, however, Archaeological surveys around the area, associated with the historical Xin'an, in what is now Henan province, have identified mass burial sites consistent with large-scale interments from this general period. Pits containing the disordered remains of many individuals, without ceremony, without grave goods, without the ordinary markers of respectful burial that even poor households in this era typically extended to their dead. Whether every one of these sites corresponds precisely to the event Sima Qian described, or whether they represent a broader pattern of mass violence from this chaotic transitional period between Qin collapse and Han consolidation, remains a subject modern archaeologists and historians continue to investigate, rather than a settled fact. What is certain is that the ground in that region has, more than once, given up evidence that something on this scale really happened there, regardless of the exact figure attached to it in the old texts. The pits are still there, under the soil, near a town most visitors to China have never heard of, holding whatever remains 2,000 years and countless intervening wars, floods, and dynasties have left behind. There is a particular kind of vertigo in standing, or in imagining standing, at a site like that. Julu itself, the town whose siege gave this story its first act of triumph, exists today only as a place name in Hebei province, its exact ancient location debated among historians, its walls long since dissolved back into the soil that farmers now, till without any obvious sign of what happened there 22 centuries ago. The idiom born from Xiang Yu's order to sink the boats and break the cauldrons, Po Fu Chen Zhou, survives in the Chinese language today, used casually by people with no particular interest in ancient history, to describe any situation where someone commits fully to a course of action by deliberately eliminating their own alternatives. A phrase spoken, probably, thousands of times a day, by people who have never once connected it to 200,000 men buried in the dark a few months after it was first put into practice. And that gap between the surviving phrase, useful and almost cheerful in its modern usage, and the buried consequence that grew directly out of the same mind that coined it, is where this story's real weight sits. Because here is the pattern underneath all of it, the thing that makes this more than a single ancient atrocity to be catalogued and moved past. Every step that led from the Jiang River to the ravines at Xin'an was individually defensible on its own terms. Song Yi's caution was a reasonable read of the military situation, even if it was also cowardice. Xiang Yu's decision to remove his own army's ability to retreat was judged purely as tactics, a documented and still studied masterstroke. Zhang Han's decision to withdraw rather than commit his reserve was the same kind of caution that had served him well through an entire year of crushing rebellions. His later decision to surrender, given the political trap closing around him from his own court, was arguably the only choice that gave his soldiers any chance of survival at all, a chance that was then taken from nearly all of them regardless. And the final council that decided on the massacre framed itself explicitly in the language of risk mitigation. A large, resentful, unreliable force marching alongside a smaller army into hostile territory represented a genuine and serious danger, and eliminating that danger before it could be realized was, within the narrow frame of that single military problem, a coherent answer. None of these men, at any individual step, needs to have been a cartoon villain twirling a mustache for the outcome to arrive at 200,000 dead. That is what should unsettle you about this story, more than any single grisly detail of the killing itself. Catastrophes on this scale rarely require a single moment of obvious, recognizable evil. They require a sequence of individually rational actors, each solving the specific, narrow problem directly in front of them, each convinced, probably correctly, by the standards of their own immediate circumstances, that they were choosing the safest available option. The mustache-twirling villain is comforting precisely because he's rare and because he's easy to identify and stop. The accumulation of reasonable people making reasonable-sounding calculations, each one slightly compounding the last, is what actually tends to produce the worst outcomes in human history. And it is far harder to see coming, because at no single point does it ever look, from the inside, like the thing it's building toward. You can walk through the ruins of empires today, through the excavated foundations of the Qin palaces Xiang Yu burned, through provincial museums in Hebei and Henan holding bronze fragments and funerary objects from this exact period, through the quiet farmland that now sits over ground that archaeologists have found unusually full of the dead, and feel almost nothing, because stone and soil don't narrate themselves. A tourist can stand exactly where 200,000 men were buried and see only a field, unless someone has told them what the field is, which is really the only thing history can offer you in the end, the telling. Not a verdict on Xiang Yu, who has been alternately celebrated as a tragic, romantic hero and condemned as a butcher by Chinese writers, poets, and historians for over 2,000 years, without either side ever quite winning the argument. Not a comfortable moral you can file away and consider yourself protected by the next time you are asked to sign off on a decision that eliminates a risk by eliminating the people who might pose it. Just the pattern, laid out as plainly as the surviving sources allow, and a question that the pattern leaves for you rather than answering itself. If you found yourself at any point watching this, quietly agreeing with the War Council's logic before you remembered what it actually authorized, that's worth sitting with too, and it's exactly the kind of thing worth saying in the comments, because you were probably not alone in it. So here is the question, and there is no comfortable answer waiting on the other side of it. If you had stood in that command tent outside Xin'an, holding the same information Xiang Yu's officers held, a surrendered force larger than your own, marching resentful and unarmed through hostile territory, it might turn to at the worst possible moment, with your own soldiers' lives and the survival of your entire campaign resting on the answer. What would you have called the safer choice? And how sure, honestly, are you that safety and mercy would have pointed you in the same direction?